Can we welcome everybody to the gathering this evening? I want to thank everybody for coming. We're delighted to see a good number gathered in. And on behalf of the Anchor-Psalm Association, I'd like to thank each and every one for making the effort to come here tonight and to see the booklet being launched and to hear the various speakers that we have lined up tonight. And some of the speakers that we have lined up tonight, folks, are, in my opinion, are excellent. And what they have to say is extremely interesting and very informative, and we hope that you will indeed learn something this evening from the presentations and the various speeches that will be made this evening. Now, our purpose for gathering here this evening, folks, is not to remember the uprising of 1916, but we're here and gathered here to remember the horrific consequences of what was an unjust, immoral actions, and that was namely the hundreds of deaths, and in particular to remember those who the very descendants of the uprising do not wish us to remember, namely the 18 officers and 90 other ranks who were murdered by these so-called Irish rebels. Even this very week, the relatives of the men who fought in the uprising very aggressively have sought to make sure that the names of the British soldiers who were killed are not included on a remembrance wall that is to be built in Dublin. They wish to airbrush the memory of these brave men from history. And we're here tonight to make sure that these folk are not airbrushed from history, and that despite what's going to go on in the province here over Easter, that we will take time tonight to remember the brave men who gave their lives in the streets of Dublin in Easter 1916. The sacrifices of these men will not be forgotten, and we will not let their names be airbrushed from history. The Easter Rising was profoundly wrong and cannot be regarded as a just war. You might say, well, yes, that's Protestant unionist rhetoric against those that rise up. That quote is not my words, but they are the words of the present day Attorney General, who is himself a devout Roman Catholic. Quite categorically, the Rising passed none of the just war criteria. In fact, it was a pagan love of war and blood sacrifice. Again, not my words, but the words of Father Seamus Murphy, a leading Irish Catholic philosopher. John Larkin further said, this unjust war lacked any democratic or constitutional legitimacy. One of the ironies of history is that the uprising is often referred to as the Sinn Féin rebellion. It could not have been a Sinn Féin inspired rebellion. Why? Because up until 1917, the policy of Sinn Féin was that of a monarchy under the Austro-Hungarian pattern, not a republic. And not until 1917 did Sinn Féin change their policy. Republicans today attach themselves to the rebels, and they are today involved in justifying what was the murderous actions of their alleged heroes. But the Dubliners of 1916 did not see these men as heroes. They spat at them as they paraded them along the street. The events in Dublin of 1916 are not justifiable. Neither was the Sinn Féin IRA campaign of the 70s, 80s or 90s. But one thing that links them both is the scurrilous words of Patrick Pearse. Patrick Pearse said, "It is a goodly thing to see arms in Irish hands. Yes, we may shoot the wrong people, but bloodshed is a cleansing and sanctifying thing. The bloodlust of Pearse is the same bloodlust of the IRA. The words and work mentality of Pearse is the same work mentality of the Irish Republican Army of today. The Troubles can never be sanctified or justified, neither can the events of Easter 1916. If you want real heroes, I point you to the men of the Psalm of 1916. If you want real heroes, I point you to the soldiers and police on the streets of Dublin in 1916. These British soldiers, many of them born in Ireland, are due every bit of honour and glory as those who died on the battlefields of the Somme and on the plains of France. Tonight we want to remember them. Tonight we want to honour them. Tonight we want to salute them. The Fenian song sung since the rebellion glorifies the rebels, and they glorify in the fight on what they term against the might of Britain. Herein lies another falsehood. The British soldiers in Dublin in 1916 were mostly recruits, boys, trainees. Some had only been in the ranks for weeks, not months. Yet they still defeated the rebels. The rebel uprising was a murderous shambles with no legitimacy and no justification. We must not allow present-day republicanism to rewrite history. And this is why we are gathered here tonight. Yes, to remember, but also to set the record straight. Truth must prevail. And I ask now Mark Jefferson, the chairman of the Anchor-Some Association, to come forward and read for us the UVF prayer.
Good evening, everyone. I'd extend a warm welcome to each of you tonight. The prayer I'm about to read was composed by the Lord Primate of the Church of Ireland. On the 3rd of April 1914, a copy of the prayer was sent to every member of the Church of Ireland within the Ulster battalions. The following prayer was said daily by each member of the Ulster Volunteer Force, morning and night. The Ulster Volunteers Prayer. Let us pray. O Heavenly Father, hear we pray thee, the prayer of thy children who call upon thee in their time of danger and difficulty. Forgive me, I pray thee, for all my sins which have so often committed against thee in thought, word and deed. Make me ready to endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Fill me with the Holy Spirit that I may know thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, and follow thee more nearly. Strengthen up and uphold me in all difficulties and dangers. Keep me faithful unto death, patient and suffering, calm in thy service, and confident in the assurance that thy Lord will direct all things to the glory of thy name and the welfare of my church and country. Bless the King, who we serve, and the royal family. O Lord, grant me thy grace, that no word or act of mine may be spoken or done rashly, hastily, or with anger towards those who differ from me. Bless all my comrades in the Ulster Volunteer Force, and make me loving and gentle, obedient to my leaders, and faithful to my promises, and in thine own good time bring peace to Ireland. All this I beg for Jesus Christ's sake. Amen.
We're delighted to have along with us this evening Councillor Carla Lockard. She's a member of the Armagh, Barnbridge and Craigavon Borough Council, and she's consented to come and speak to us this evening. Carla.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Mark, as well, for your kind welcome along. It's absolutely fantastic to look down and see so many people gathered in. I know that the organisers certainly, when you start to organise these things, you do panic a little, will people turn up? But I think tonight is testament of the fact that there are so many within this borough and further afield that want to hear about our history and that want to learn about the right and proper way of the Easter Rebellion. I don't want to get into the history side of it, because I know you have great orators coming later who have researched it for many years, and certainly we're looking forward to it. And could I just say, I think from my perspective as a local councillor, I think that's a problem that we need to address locally and regionally. We are not, as people, educated in our history. Unfortunately, and I speak very personally here as a young person, 31-year-old, I know whenever I was at school, you were taught about the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and you never were actually told about your own history and about the history of Ireland and of the formation of Northern Ireland. So I really personally believe that's a mantra that we need to take up, and that's a baton that we need to take up, and we need to go to our educationalists, and we need to engage with them, and we need to try and ensure that our young people and our children are educated in the right and proper way. Certainly the book that we have before us tonight, I really have to commend the group on their hard work and their effort in formulating it. I think it's an absolutely fantastic production. It's actually very humbling and very educational as well. I have to say, as I took a flick through it today, I really was deeply moved by the content and by the names listed in the booklet. And obviously being a Lurgan councillor, speaking very personally about Lurgan, and the fact that there are two names within it that came and hailed from Lurgan. And we have James Howard and David Wilson. James Howard Calvert and David Wilson. James Howard Calvert obviously came from the Avenue Road estate and the Avenue Road area, and certainly it's very humbling to think that one of these brave men walked the very streets that we walk on a daily basis. And they came from there and they went and they fought for our country and for right and proper and truth and justice. And I think that's very humbling. I know certainly in terms of James Calvert, there is a little bit more information about it, and I think that's very interesting. I think it's been captured well in the book. And I know then David Wilson, there's maybe not just so much on him, but again, we must remember the fact that he did come from Lurgan and he did serve and he died, that we can stand here tonight with freedom to do so. So tonight, I just want to commend the Angry Song Association. I think they have done a fantastic job in raising awareness and pulling together all of this information. I think they've actually been quite trailblazing in terms of what they have done, because to the best of my knowledge, I don't think that this is actually recorded anywhere else, and I certainly have made inquiries about that, and I don't think it's recorded anywhere else. So I think it's absolutely fantastic that you have done it. Certainly when you spoke about it, almost I think maybe 12 months ago, you know, sometimes you think, will we actually get to the far end? Well, tonight you made it, and you have a fantastic production that will be here for generations to come. So I want to really commend the small nucleus of people, and they know who they are, and you'll see them tonight, that have really put time and effort into formulating this book and to writing it. And I want to thank you for the invitation along, and I want to thank you for the work that you're doing in the Lurgan community and further afield in terms of raising awareness. So keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Clara for them words, and much appreciated indeed. And thank you for taking the time to come and be with us this evening. We appreciate that tonight. Now, our first presentation and our speaker tonight is Mr. Quincy Dugan, and I'm sure quite a few in this room will be familiar with Quincy. If you read the newsletter at all, you'll see a lot of stuff in it from himself, and he indeed covers the whole of North and even into the South as he brings his various lectures and presentations far and wide. So we're delighted to have him with us this evening, and the floor now is all yours, brother.
Insurrection, 1916, a unionist perspective. The insurrection during Easter 1916 involved less than 1,700 men and women. It was the brainchild and initiative of a minority, of a minority, of a minority. A small conspiratorial grouping within the leadership of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who itself had been using and manipulating the Irish volunteers behind the scenes, who in turn had broken away from the populist Irish, later renamed Irish National Volunteers. A group of self-indulgent individuals unrepresentative of Irish society in terms of class or political aspiration, and indifferent to that reality. When Patrick Pearse read the personally penned proclamation of the Irish Republic on the 24th of April, while civilians, self-styled as volunteers of the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizen Volunteers, occupied prominent public buildings, the British Army was indeed caught by surprise. Once the surprise had settled, however, its personnel very quickly quelled and then crushed the insurrectionists. The unqualified defeat of the rebels did not take place, nevertheless, until the events they had initiated took the lives of almost 500 men, women and children, injured in excess of 2,000, and created damage and loss to Dublin City amounting to over £3 million, a modern equivalent of between 180 and £300 million. In purely military terms, their actions had been an absolute and resounding failure. Over and above all of the modern political interpretations and hindsight opinion and thought, the one indisputable thing that the rebellion delivered is that death. The specific causes of each individual death are in many ways irrelevant. They died. The definitive figures now accepted are that 485 people lost their lives during the disturbances. Over half were civilians caught in the crossfire, with the last day alone seeing 45 deaths of non-combatants. Ordinary men and women, Catholic and Protestant, caught up in the middle of a rebellion they knew nothing about and most likely would have had little affinity with. The more horrifying statistic is that among their number, 38 of the dead were under 16 years of age. Men, women and children who had their life extinguished to placate ideological and borderline fanatical desires of a tiny few. On the cusp of the Great War, commentary on the Irish situation had all but come to the conclusion that civil war was not just possible, but inevitable, reinforced by sources within the intelligence ranks of the Royal Irish Constabulary. In July 1914, the RIC Inspector for County Cavan commented on UVF and Irish volunteer activity that the outlook is dangerous. While in nearby Monaghan, his equivalent stated in his July report that between the two parties, danger of collision is considerable. Whilst the Ulster Volunteers had no presence in much of the south and west of Ireland, there were some pockets of anti-Home Rule volunteers in Dublin, Cork, Wicklow, Sligo, Longford and Leitrim, potential battle lines were being suggested. George Berkeley, an Irish volunteer commander in Belfast, related how a southern friend had been told by a fellow Home Ruler, asserting that for every Catholic shot by the Orange men in the north, I'll get 5 Protestants down here. The war changed that instantaneously. Perhaps because of the conscious or even subconscious knowledge that it was an opportunity to step back from the brink without loss of face. Throughout Ireland, the war effort was embraced across creed and class boundaries. The numbers involved are debated, but over 200,000 Irishmen fought in the war, while as many as 49,000 died, depending on the criteria used to define what was an Irishman. They enlisted for many different reasons. Some did so for Ulster, and some did so for Ireland. Others joined simply to make sure their wives and families could be provided for. Others still to escape heavy, laborious work in mills and factories. Some joined through peer pressure and community pressure, and some simply joined for adventure. For all, the reasons were less important and less relevant to both the men and to their families than the simple fact that they were physically at war or dealing with the absence of those at war. Within this specific context, the rebellion instantly generated a hatred and anger among hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Irish men and women. Individuals who felt a deep resentment of these people in Dublin who should countenance such actions while their loved ones were in far-off fields fighting and dying for the good of Ireland and for Ireland itself. This was not just a rebellion. This was a mutiny. On the 27th of April 1916, on the fields of Hulla, northern France, the 16th Irish Division found themselves on the end of a German gas attack. Just one of many events on the fields of the battles of the Great War that week. In that one incident, the 16th Irish Division lost 442 men, almost to a man, Irishmen. Their deaths having taken place while the Easter rebels were proudly emphasising that they were supported by and they de facto returned support to the perpetrators. People the rebels described as gallant allies. During the rebellion, men from the reserve of the 36th Ulster Division also travelled south to support the forces engaged in quelling the trouble. Several would die. Of the British soldiers killed in the execution of their duty during Easter week in Dublin, 22 were Irishmen. As aforementioned, not much less than 250,000 people, Irish people fought in the Great War. About 1,600 took part in that rebellion. At Easter 1916, a 30-year-old East Belfast man and his brother travelled to Dublin. James and Joseph Mitchell visited the Theatre Royal to watch a show, attended a function in local military barracks, and on Easter Sunday, James completed what he had visited Dublin to do in the first place. He enlisted in the British Army. On Easter Monday, the brothers attended the races at Ferryhouse, where they became aware of the disturbances in the city, and shortly after found themselves confined to the Gresham Hotel. James kept a diary of events in the week to follow. As the rebellion was coming to a close, he penned a sentence that adequately reflected the opinions of those disgusted at the timing of the affair. I felt relief and secretly exulted at the inglorious end of the creatures with such selfish minds. Ireland's religious divisions and boundaries have rarely been far from the surface since the Reformation, and the Third Home Rule crisis had once again elevated them to a position of eminent importance. Rightly or wrongly, one of the central tenets of Irish Unionist objections to Home Rule was a fear of the Catholic Church. Fears that freedom of religion, of expression, and even simply that their individualism would be taken away from them in a Catholic-dominated Ireland. Founded in centuries-old animosities and experiences, these fears were very, very real for the people who held them. And they became manifest not by reference to Protestantism in the Ulster Covenant, but through the words that Home Rule would be subversive of our civil and religious liberties. Confirmation of the subversive links between Catholicism and the rebellion first became underlined with its simple timing, coming alongside the religious festival of Easter. A Christian festival for all denominations, the scheduling was indeed intended to coincide with a holiday period when it would be easier to mobilise men. But it also had a much deeper resonance for the devoutly Catholic conspirators. Some 2 weeks prior to the events, Papal Count George Plunkett was dispatched to Rome to seek the blessing of Pope Benedict XV. Plunkett later recorded that the Pope had been very much moved as he explained to him the reasons for the date of the rebellion and pledged the fidelity of the organisers to the Holy See and the interests of religion. After the audience, the Pope conferred his apostolic benediction on the men who were facing death for Ireland's liberty. Plunkett would later be Sinn Féin's first chosen candidate for the Roscommon by-election in 1917. During the events themselves, within the confines of the rebellion headquarters in the GPO, from the outset the Rosary was recited on a half-hourly basis. This particular element is cited as being one of the reasons responsible for the few Protestant participants converting to Catholicism during the proceedings. In its immediate aftermath, whilst pulpits across Ireland did indeed see priests deliver messages of condemnation, they were short-lived and did not actually reflect the church hierarchy. Of the 31 Catholic bishops of Ireland, only 7 actually came out to condemn the rebels. As an additional aside, but an irrelevant one, at the Sinn Féin Convention of April 1917, 10% of all the delegates were Catholic priests. Across the centuries, Irish nationalists and Irish Republican leaders many times endeavoured to convince the foolish non-Catholics of Ireland that their religion and entwined social values and cultural traditions were respected and would be protected if only they would see sense and conform to their view of Irish nationhood. That their cause was about nation and rights, not religion. With Easter 1916, the connection unionism already believed there was between Irish nationalist political ambition and Catholicism was clearly illustrated. The instantaneous establishment of the commemoration of the rebellion remaining at Easter, irrespective of the date, possibly the only non-biblical anniversary in the world that binds itself in such a way to a religious festival, permanently cemented unionist opinion. The rebellion and Catholicism were inextricably linked. A central feature of the rebellion, arguably the most symbolic element, was the proclamation of the Irish Republic. Within it, the insurrectionists, or more accurately, the document's seven co-signatories, declared Ireland's independence from the United Kingdom, and with it outlined their motivations and goals to the country and to the world. It included an apparent olive branch, an offer to the Unionists of the North East, who were so at odds with the ideas of Irish nation. The promise to cherish all of the children of the nation equally came with assurances of religious and civil liberties, equal rights and equal opportunities. By the same token, as quickly as the hand of friendship was offered, it was taken away. The proclamation demanded and claimed a full legitimate entitlement to the allegiance of every citizen within the declared republic. Rights were offered, but solely within the definitions of conformity. The events of the Third Home Rule crisis had illustrated very clearly that the Covenanters of Ireland were not just a religious grouping. Everything leading to and surrounding the Ulster Covenant very clearly underlined that these individuals were an ethnic grouping in their own right, with their own views of Irish history, their own ideas of collective identity. These people considered themselves Irish, but within a broader British identity. The proclamation reduced this massive swathe of its nation to being impudent fools. The proclamation, without any recognition of the irony, included a token gesture of friendship to these misguided family members of Ireland, within a manuscript that holistically was confirming that they were enemies and that they were now officially at war. Prior to the events in Dublin, the debate on the potential partition of Ireland had raged for several years. It was not an automatic given, but when partition was referred to specifically, Ulster Unionists initially were adamant that all 9 Ulster counties must be included in any partition solution. The stance was underlined by the monumental Ulster Covenant campaign and many other reaffirming public pronouncements. Behind the scenes, however, many were beginning to waver as to the composition of any hypothetical new Ulster. In July 1914, the Buckingham Palace Conference, called by King George V to bring together Irish Unionist and Nationalist leaders, first heard the idea of a 6-county partition solution mooted at a level of officialdom. The conference broke up without agreement, but it did result in an amended Government of Ireland Act 1914, the Third Home Rule Bill, passing Parliament with the composition of the Ulster referenced within it ambiguous. The partition of Ireland was on hold, and while discussion continued on the subject, the war effort and cause kept the issue on hold, it being seen as of much lesser importance than the events on the Western Front and elsewhere. And with that hold, there was still hope within all sides, that partition could be avoided. Partition was still, even at this stage, not inevitable. The subject was deemed to be of secondary importance, and it could wait. And perhaps, just perhaps, solutions could be found. The rebellion changed that, and indeed changed the entire dynamic of the partition debate. Firstly, at a very superficial level, the events in Dublin reaffirmed Unionist belief that Irish nationalism was untrustworthy. In a single week, Unionist predictions of revolt and subversion, if stranded in an Ireland in which it was a minority, were realised. Beyond this, an infinitely important element, at a practical level, there were other developments, new developments. British political relations with America were suffering. As a direct result of the events of the aftermath of the rebellion, the Irish diaspora in America having immense political influence. The Minister of Munitions, David Lloyd George, was determined to rectify this by forcing through an amended 1914 Government of Ireland Act to achieve greater Irish political stability. Lloyd George again raised the proposal to add the exclusion of the 6 northeastern counties to the bill, and Chorson, made to believe that the option was the best within the context of the current war effort, agreed to the modification. It had to be sold to his people, however, and that sale resulted in a further important amendment, the addition of permanent exclusion. The rebellion was directly responsible for the partition of Ireland defined in legislation, and it saw its permanent exclusion enshrined in legislation, both coming alongside further entrenching of existing alienation within unionism, ensuring that no stepping back or lesser accommodations would be possible. Patrick Buckland commented in his 1972 book Irish Unionism, referring to the revolutionaries, if their aim was to prevent a moderate settlement of the Irish question, they certainly succeeded. It is beyond question that the events of the Easter Rebellion aftermath generated empathy and sympathy for Sinn Féin, alongside delivering a further long-term legacy of establishing for some the legitimacy of murder and terror to further political goals. The quasi-military proceedings also had many other more immediate consequences. The dead and wounded, inclusive of some 38 children, including one just 22 months old. Hurt and resentment among those who were active in supporting and fighting in the Great War then in progress. The H.G. Wells coined war to end war. The entrenchment of sectarian battle lines in Ireland and the reinforcement of fear of religious persecution. The contradictory proclamation of the Irish Republic, simultaneously extending a hand of friendship to Irish Unionists and yet also a declaration of war against them. And perhaps most fundamentally, the virtual guarantee of the previously just theoretical partition of Ireland. The poetic, romantically christened Easter Rising did indeed give much to Ireland.
Thank you very much, Quincy. Tremendous stuff and well presented, and very enlightening to say the least. We're now going to have a musical interval, and we have delighted to have Rhonda Kennedy with us this evening. I'm going to invite her to come forward now, and she's going to sing for us, okay?
Just north of Belfast, the White House is row on row, where was raised an Ulster family. How proudly they did grow, now proud and happy parents watch their son grow to a man, and they taught him truth and justice in this part of Ireland. And one day there came a letter to his comrades. He would go to a land across the water, where tears and blood would flow. So he waved farewell to Ulster, and next morning at the dawn, a broken-hearted mother sent her son off to the song. Then one night, as she lay sleeping in a dream, there at the door stood a handsome-looking soldier, the king's colors he did wore. He said, "Mother, don't you know me? Let me in, I'm feeling cold." But the crimson blood upon his chest, the fatal story told. There's a town just north of Belfast, where a father proudly There's a graveyard north of the fold. The white crosses row on row, where he sleeps beside his comrades now, in the fields where the red poppies grow. Yes, he sleeps beside his comrades now, in the fields where the red poppies grow. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. Up to mighty London came an Irish lad one day. All the streets were paved in gold, so everyone was gay, singing songs of Piccadilly, Strand and Leicester Square, till Paddy got excited and he shouted to them there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. Paddy wrote a letter to his Irish Molly, oh, saying should you not receive it, write and let me know. If I make mistakes in spelling, Molly dear, he said, remember it's the pen that's bad, don't place the blame on me. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. Molly wrote a neat reply to Irish Paddy, oh, saying Mike Maloney wants to marry me, and so leave the Strand and Piccadilly, or you'll be to blame. For love has fairly drove me mad, hoping you're the same. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. just a day, another day beneath the Belgian sun, past grave on grave, row on row, until I see the name John Condon, carved in stone with harp and crown, little crosses in the ground, and standing there, my silent prayer is for a boy who died a soldier. We lie will not grow old, heroes that don't come home. Here they lie in Belgium fields and just a recruit in soldier's boots from Harran shores to here. This living hell, this pulpit hell, where young men fell like you, John Condon, and all around the harp and crown, little crosses in the ground, stand up and prove the bitter truth, the waste of youth that lies forgotten. We lie, will not grow old, heroes that don't come home. Here they lie in Belgium fields and now tell me, John, before I go on, what did you come here for? With Darren's bones, your life untold, 14 years old to die a soldier, and all around the harp and crown, little crosses in the ground. One cause was served, so undeserved. Heroes that don't come home, sing out for all their souls. Here they lie in Belgium fields and
Folks, well deserved. I think we'll give an all round applause there. Thank you very much. We certainly enjoyed that, and certainly has added a flavour to the evening. So I want to thank you very, very much. Really enjoyed that. Our next speaker, we're delighted to have him along here this evening, Lieutenant Colonel Maher from the London Irish Rifles Association, Northern Ireland chairman, and he's going to come now and do presentations for us, please.
sweet before strong. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Try not to shout. I am, as said, Colonel Maha. I'm a serving Royal Irish officer. Everything I say tonight is my own personal thoughts. It's nothing to do with the army or their thought process, what they're thinking, etc., etc. So run with me. I'm planning on looking tonight at the Easter Rising, no surprises there, looking at the facts. You see me in the picture there with Sergeant Johnson Bahari, winner of the Victoria Cross, first man to win the Victoria Cross for gallantry in 40 years. I'm going to go through 14 points with you today. I'm going to start off with a preamble, some thoughts, go into an introduction of Easter 1916, talk briefly about the political background within the UK, Ireland in 1916, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, protagonists and leaders, mobilisation, proclamation, positions occupied, Crown forces, the aftermath, claiming and myths, death statistics, and a brief conclusion. I welcome audience participation, by the way, so if you have a question, just stick your hand up and we'll deal with it. I'd like to ask you 3 questions before we start, and I'd like you to think about them during the presentation, and then we'll come back at them towards the end. And the 3 questions are: who were the Irish Republican forces? Who were the British forces? And why did it happen, and should it have happened, as in the uprising? The last piece of my preamble, I want to talk about Trooper Patrick Glean. He was an Irishman, born and raised in County Limerick, and he joined the 5th Regiment of Royal Irish Lancers, which in Dublin in 1916 was part of the 6th Reserve Cavalry Regiment, then based in Marlborough Barracks in Dublin. Now, you might ask the question, why do I want to talk about Trooper Patrick Glean? There was a book recently brought out on the uprising, and in it, the author was approached by a parish priest in Southern Ireland and asked if he knew anything about one of his relatives. He was a family hero, and he was Trooper Patrick Glean, because the family history had it that he was shot by the English during Easter 1916 for refusing to fight against the Republicans. That was the family history. The author went away, researched him, and came back with an astonishingly different story, which, surprise, surprise, the family were not happy with at all. Trooper Patrick Glean came out of Marlborough Barracks on the Monday morning of Easter and rode with a troop of horses along O'Connell Street and was shot by the rebels in the GPO. He wasn't underage like the family thought. He wasn't a conscript, because there was never conscription in Ireland. But he was a brave Irish soldier, and he was doing his duty. He wasn't shot by the English, he was shot by Republican forces from the GPO. I would like to look at the evidence. I would like to make it as non-political as possible. I'd like to make it as realistic as possible. I'd like you to draw your own conclusions. I'd like to think about the consequences and what relevance the antics of Easter 1916 have to you today in 2016. During the presentation, I will refer back to some military tactics. I've served myself all around the world. I served as a peacekeeper in Bosnia during the war there. So I was delighted to see that scumbag Radovan Karadzic be found guilty yesterday for mass genocide. I've served in Afghanistan, and I've also served here in Ulster for many years. Background and politics. We have a large part of society that is very vocal in telling you that during 1916 all they were doing was fighting for equality, human rights, and all that, what I would call nonsense. when you actually look at politics, it's quite interesting. In 1880, in the old Sarum ward in England, not in Ireland, in England, there was 2 MPs elected. There was 3 houses in old Sarum ward, 15 people who are eligible to vote. In the Gatton ward in England, there was 1 MP elected. There was only 1 voter in 1880. Yes. So when you look at it, politics are very murky. If you're telling me, or if you're definitely not, I'm sure, but certain people are telling me that all people wanted, the rebels wanted in 1916, was fair political representation, I put it to you, that's not quite true. When you look at the Cato Street Radicals in 1820s, again, in England, they wanted to reform the electoral system. 5 of them were put to death and 5 of them transported. So it's not something that just happened in Ireland. The second reform, wrong. The reform happened in 1832, which meant 1 in 7 people in the UK could vote. The second reform came in 1867, and only 2.5 million people out of 30 million population in the United Kingdom could vote. The third reform, in 1884, 5 million people could vote. So that's a bit about the politics of the United Kingdom at that time. A quick run through politics and background of Ireland. You obviously have the 1798 rebellion. As a result of that came the Act of Union, which saw the abolishment of the Parliament of Ireland. Between 1830 and 40, the Repeal Association was very dominant in Ireland, with Daniel O'Connell, known as the Liberator. In 1886, the first Home Rule was defeated in the Commons. The second bill was defeated in 1893 in the Lords. However, by 1900, the Irish Parliamentary Party was the 3rd largest party in Westminster. John Redmond was their leader, and he was heavily backed by the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and we'll touch on them later on. They were a very right-wing organisation, and uber-Catholic, ultra-Catholic in everything they did and conducted. In 1806, the Liberals won the general election. In 1914, the 3rd bill was passed. The Government of Ireland Act of 1940 came into existence. 1914, the Great War started. And in 1920, the 4th bill was created. Another point on the background of politics is Dublin Castle. It was the seat of administrative government in Ireland. All appointments in Dublin Castle were made by the British Cabinet in London. And at that point, British representation was only 1/6 of the Commons. So all of the appointments for the administration of Ireland were made by the Cabinet. 1910 general election. For those of you at the back who haven't got X-ray vision, the blue parts are Conservative and Liberal Unionists, and the green parts are various nationalist organisations. The Irish Republican Brotherhood. If you're talking about the Irish Uprising, 1916, it should really be entitled the IRB Uprising. It was formed in 1857 by James Stephens, Thomas Clark Luby, John Devoy, the unrepentant Fenian, and Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosser. Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosser is an interesting character in the fact that he died in 1915. In 1915, he had a large funeral in Glasnevin, North Dublin, and at that funeral, Patrick Pearse made the comments, "The fools, the fools, the fools. They have left us our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland will never be at peace." Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosser's funeral really galvanised the Irish volunteers, in particular the IRB and the Fenians amongst them. In 1867, the Supreme Council was formed of the IRB, and James Stephens declares an Irish Republic. Phenomenal. This is a secret organisation And one man in this small secret organisation of blokes declares an Irish Republic. The rudeness of that strikes me incredibly. It really does. How can he declare an Irish Republic? You know, it's nonsense, absolute nonsense. However, after 1867, they had a very successful Fenian bombing campaign, particularly in London. And in 1883, the Metropolitan Police was forced to form the Irish Special Branch, which we now know as Special Branch, and since 2002, even they have been done away with. I'm touching on politics, I apologise. So the Irish Republican Brotherhood was organised into circles. They had one leader, 9 captains, 9 sergeants, and 9 soldiers. I call them captains, sergeants, and soldiers. They obviously weren't, they were just a group of friends who were intent on doing damage. However, they were a highly secret organisation and a highly Catholic organisation in their doctrine and in what they believed. They bore true allegiance to the Supreme Council of the IRB, the government of the Irish Republic, which they had set up themselves, and implicitly obeyed the constitution of the IRB, superior officers, and preserved the secrets of the organisation. When you look at these circles, if you were a soldier, you only knew the sergeants. If you were a sergeant, you only knew the captain. If you were a captain, you only knew the leader. And that's how they worked. It was a highly secretive organisation. According to the IRB constitution, the president, in fact, as well as by right, is regarded as the head of the government of the Irish Republic. The IRB is still in existence in 2016. It's a secret organisation, so it's not talked about. I'll say that again. According to the IRB constitution, the president, in fact, as well as by right, is regarded as the head of the government of the Irish Republic. Protagonists and leaders. The signatories of the Easter uprisings: Thomas Clarke, IRB man; Sean McDermott, IRB; Thomas MacDonagh, IRB; Patrick Henry Pearse, IRB; Edward Thomas Kent, IRB; James Connolly, IRB; Joseph Plunkett, IRB. All of them were in the IRB. It was an IRB uprising. However, let's have a look at these people. Thomas Clarke, born in an army barracks in the Isle of Wight. His father was a British Army soldier. Thomas MacDonagh, a university lecturer. Patrick Pearse, teacher. His mother was English. His father was a sculptor. Sculptor, I should say. Freudian slip there. Edward Kent, his father was in the Royal Irish Constabulary. James Connolly was born and bred in Edinburgh, had a Scottish accent all his life, was a former British Army sergeant. His brother was serving in the Scots Guards, was a corporal in the Scots Guards, and 2 months after James Connolly was shot, he was killed on the Western Front. Joseph Plunkett, we've already touched on him. Quincy touched on him. His father was a Count Plunkett. And Joseph himself was educated at Stonyhurst Public School in England, which is the premier public school in England for Catholics. Constance Gore Booth, her father was Sir Henry Gore Booth. She married a distant Polish count and became Countess Markovich. And Sir Roger Casement was a now British diplomat. I put it to you guys, these guys aren't the socialists, the communists of Sinn Féin today. They are all university lecturers, British Army soldiers, teachers, counts, knights of the realm. Those are the leaders that took part in it. The units that took part. We touched on the Irish National Volunteers. The Irish Citizens' Army was James Connolly's private army. It was a workers' communist army. The Hibernian Rifles were a small unit, part of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, ultra-Catholic in everything they did, and highly financed from America and Clan na Gael organisation there. Cumann na mBan was the women's organisation. Again, today we have various political parties telling you that they're very much in favour of women's rights. The Kanaman weren't able or were not allowed to carry weapons there. They were allowed to carry messages and patch up the wounded. That's the only thing they were allowed to do. The proclamation, Quincy's gone through that one at depth. What I'd like to talk about now is the principles of defence from a military perspective. And those are all 7 points. Depth, mutual support, all-round defence, concealment, having a reserve, ground and administration, as in coordination, logistics and intelligence. And I'd like to look now at the positions occupied by the rebels in 1916. You start at the top here, the General Post Office. Huge big building on O'Connell Street. Boland's Flour Mill, down here. Northumberland Road, St Stephen's Green, College of Surgeons, Jacobs Factory, City Hall, Four Courts, and South Dublin Union, which was a poorhouse. It was, what's the word I'm looking for? Poorhouses. People were sent to them when they couldn't look after themselves. Workhouse, thank you, workhouse. So let's look briefly at this. Depth positions, well, they were roughly in a semicircle around Dublin. Yep. Depth position, yeah, they had a bit of that. Mutual support, no. Absolutely no mutual support whatsoever. GPO's on the middle of a main street. There's about 400 people stuffed in the GPO. There's no mutual support. There's no all-round defence. They can only see a small arc in front of them up and down O'Connell Street. Concealment, well, the GPO is one of the biggest buildings at the time in O'Connell Street, so there's no concealment. They had no reserve. They didn't study the ground. They didn't look at administration. They didn't think about food, water, ammunition, and how to pass intelligence about where the British Army was. Bear in mind that they've had years to plan this, and they tell you that they're soldiers, they give themselves military ranks. The first thing you would look at is the principles of defence. And I put it to you, every single position here, with the exception of perhaps one, Northumberland Road, has not been looked at with the principles, the military principles of defence. So the volunteer strong points, Quincy's already touched on them, the numbers. So you had the GPO with nearly 500 people stuffed in it, just a big building in the middle of a street. Whereas you had the most strategically important building, Northumberland Road, you had only 13 people in it. St Stephen's Green, huge big green, overlooked by 5-6-storey houses, and they decided it'd be a really good idea to dig trenches there, which were completely overlooked from 6-storey houses. Shocking. As a military man, I find the tactics laughable, utterly laughable. The British strong points, they tell you, are Dublin Castle. Dublin Castle was heavily protected. Not. It was protected by the Dublin Metropolitan Police, who were a completely unarmed constabulary. Their armament consisted of about 12-inch truncheons. The Imperial Hotel. Well, the Imperial Hotel's a strong point because there was a lot of officers there on leave from the Western Front. And Trinity College, well, Trinity College is where the Officer Training Corps was. So you had a bunch of students in there. Hardly British strong points. I'd now like to talk about fighting components. There's 3 components: conceptual, moral, and physical. If you want to fight, you have to use these 3 components. The conceptual component, I'm difficult with this, aren't I? Conceptual component is your ideas on how you're going to operate and fight. Your education of conflict and your doctrine, as in reading books on how to fight. We've already looked at some of their doctrine, digging trenches in the middle of a park overlooked by 6-storey houses. But you've got to know how to operate, and you've got to know how to fight. You have to know how to hold a rifle. You have to know how to shoot. You have to know what to do when you see the enemy. That's just doctrine on how to be a soldier. Well, they told us, or they tell us, these volunteer soldiers have been doing this for years, and they know what they're doing because they're captains or they're commandants. Well, I put it to you, their conceptual fighting power was 0. So let's look at the second component of fighting power, which is your moral component, which is your ability to operate and fight. And I would put it to you that at this point, the Irish Volunteers really are streaks and bounds ahead of us, and I'll tell you the reason why. They had very little ethics, I would say. I would say when you look at the statistics of 40 children dying, their ethics were in the sewer. However, their moral cohesion and motivation, I would say, are very high. They must passionately believe, for whatever misguided way, in what they are doing. So I'd say the moral component, from a military point of view, is quite high. Whereas their physical component, as in their means to operate and fight, I'd say that was reasonably high. Their manpower, they had 1,500 armed men on the street. They had equipment. They were all, well, the majority of them were armed with rifles, if not shotguns. And they tell us that they were trained soldiers, they were trained volunteers. But their sustainment definitely let themselves down. Because they didn't think about water, they didn't think about food, and they didn't think of how they would look after their men in the field. Which, as an army officer, I can tell you, is one of my priorities. I look after my men and my women under my command, and I make sure they are fed. If there's a queue, anyone that served in the army will tell you that all the officers feed last. Quite easy and simple to explain. I look after my men and women under my command. I must think about their sustainment. Interesting map here of Crown Forces. It shows, for those of you at the back, the 3 dark red and orange areas, Cork, Dublin, down in Antrim, are the highest number of soldiers killed in action during the First World War. And then it goes to dark green and light green. Quite easily, the lighter colours are where the biggest unionist populations are. I'd now like to look at the Crown Forces that are available in Dublin during the Rising. You have the Royal Irish Rifles. Their recruiting took part in Antrim, Down and Louth. You have the Royal Irish Fusiliers, whose main recruiting areas were Armagh, Monaghan and Cavan. The Dublin Fusiliers, County Dublin, Carlow, Kildare and Wicklow. The Enniskillen Fusiliers, Fermanagh, Donegal, Tyrone and Londonderry. The Royal Irish Regiment, the 18th Foot, Kilkenny, Tipperary, Waterford and Wexford. And the Leinster Regiment, at the bottom there, from counties of Longford, Meath, Westmeath, Offaly and Laois. All of these regiments were heavily involved in the first stages of the Rising. But I'd also like to talk from a military perspective about a couple of the terms that are used. You hear the reserve about reserve battalions and extra reserve battalions. Reserve and extra reserve battalions in the First World War were basically men that were too old to fight, men like this geezer here and that fella down there, or too young. Yes, he's not starving. Or too young, these 3 fellas here. Or medically unfit or recovering from wounds. Typically these guys here in hospitals recovering from wounds. This fella up here, he's got 2 wound stripes on his sleeve and a very mangled arm. He would usually have been found in a reserve or extra reserve battalion because he's medically unfit through wounds received. Their function, reserve or extra reserve function, was to supply drafts to fighting units once they were fit or old. Reservist battalions are very different. They are men under training or fit for deployment. Their function was to make a fighting battalion. Garrison battalions, they were for home service. They were not war or service battalions, and their function was to hold ground and maintain a footprint within the country, usually old fellas and this old timer here. So in 1916, we had 4 main units in Dublin. We had the 3rd Reserve Battalion, Royal Irish Rifles, in Portobello Barracks. There was 21 officers, 650 other ranks. We had the 3rd Reserve Battalion, Royal Irish Regiment, in Richmond Barracks, with 18 officers, 385 ranks. We had the 10th Service Battalion, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Commercial PALs, in Dublin. They had 37 officers and 430 other ranks. They were a service battalion, and they were awaiting deployment to France. They were ready to go, fully trained, fully up to speed. You also had the 6 Reserve Cavalry Regiments in Marlborough Barracks, with 35 officers and 851 other ranks. They were a conglomerate of cavalry regiments from all different regiments, put together as a reserve regiment. Medically downgraded, unfit, too old, too young, etc. So that's what we had in Dublin at the time, which was all up 2,385 men. We also had, in Kildare Camp, we had the 5th Extra Reserve Leinster Regiment, 3rd Reserve Royal Dublin Fusiliers in Cork, and the 4th Extra Reserve Battalion Dublin Fusiliers in Tipperary. In Ulster, we had the 15th Ulster Reserve Brigade, comprising the Royal Irish Rifles, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and the Enniskillen Fusiliers. At the bottom, I've stuck in, they don't really come into it, because they were only formed in March, April 1916, 2 garrison battalions in Dublin. Who else did we have? As already touched on, the Dublin Metropolitan Police was an unarmed constabulary. The man in the picture here is Constable O'Brien. He was the first casualty of the uprising. He stood guard on the beat outside Dublin Castle. The Irish Citizens' Army came along, a fellow called Connolly, nothing to do with James, called himself a captain, I snigger. He went up to Constable O'Brien and shot him in the chest. He was the first casualty. But karma's a funny thing, because Connolly was the first casualty of the rebel forces as well. He was shot shortly afterwards. Karma, it will always get you. Typical Dublin Metropolitan policeman of the period. You also had the Irish Volunteer Training Corps, the GRs, usually men of a senior age or a reserved occupation. At the time of the rising, they had rifles, but they had no ammunition. So let's recap. You've got 2,385 Crown forces. They're completely unprepared. There's no intelligence that this is going to happen. They're on Easter holiday, most of them. Most of them aren't even in the barracks. A lot of them are undertrained, overaged, underaged, they're wounded. And definitely at the beginning of the conflict, they are completely confused. They haven't got a clue what's going on. Whereas the rebel forces, you've got 1,600 of them. They've had years of secret planning. Years of secret planning to do this. So they must be on tip-top. They really must. They have planned, defended locations. They have spent days thinking how to defend the building. They must be fanatical, and they must be very ideological in their approach. However, down the bottom here, I'll give you some military statistics. As an army officer, if I'm assaulting any position, I want a ratio of 3 to 1. I want 3 times more than what I'm attacking. And that's Army doctrine. However, Army doctrine also states, if I'm attacking a well-defended, prepared position, I want a statistic of 10 to 1. I want 10 times more forces than what I'm attacking. At the moment, it's not looking too good. 2,400 Crown forces against 1,600 rebels. It's not looking good. So what do we do? As the rising goes on, we send for reinforcements. We get 3 brigades from England. They have to travel over from England. They are service battalions. They are ready to go. They are trained soldiers, as opposed to our own Irish reserve battalions. But it takes days for them to come. And when they do, they land at Dunleary, Kingstown, form up in military units. They form up in column of route, and they march into Dublin City. When you look at these booklets, you'll see about half of the British Army casualties are from these three brigades. From the Sherwood Foresters, the Notts and Derby Regiment, and the Lincoln Regiment. Talk a bit about the aftermath. I snigger whenever I see a picture of Patrick Pearse. You will never see him face on, because he had one eye that was down his face and one eye that was up his face. So you always see pictures of him on profile. That is him giving the surrender there to General Maxwell. Eamon de Valera, who came in, was the only commandant of the rebel forces who wasn't executed, because he's American, he was born in America. You see around Lurgan today, lots of green flags with Irish Republic on them. This picture down here is of the Royal Irish Regiment. Above the General Post Office in Dublin, they flew this Irish Republic flag, and for the first time they flew a tricolour of green, white and orange. Green for the Nationalists, white for peace, green for the Unionists. The first time it had been seen was 1916, and the Dubliners at the time were completely confused because they'd never seen this French-looking flag, and they'd never heard of an Irish Republic either. One of the Irish rebels was a volunteer, Rob Holland, and that's what he said afterwards. And interestingly, the Irish Times and the Irish Independent demanded the death sentence of all the leaders in 1916. So the two biggest papers in Ireland demanded the death of all the leaders. And the Irish Times in 1917, actually brought out a handbook called the Sinn Féin Handbook in 1917, all about the rising. Up to quite recently, that was the definitive account from both sides of what actually happened in it. But again, it's wrongly titled. There's nothing to do with Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin, as Quincy's already ably pointed out, weren't on for this rising. It was an IRB rising. It was a secret blokes organisation, very right-wing Catholic in its views, and it was their rising. So let's look at some myths. This ship here is the ship that you usually hear if you hear about the uprising, that the British brought in a battleship, HMS Helga. Well, this is the said battleship. It's got one 3-pound gun on the front, and that is it. That is the British warship that was sailed up the Liffey to shell Dublin. Ironically, and again, calm as a bitch really, because when the Free State was formed in 1923, the first ship the Free State got was HMS Helga. Hence the tricolour on the back. The two stamps are issued by the Irish government this Easter. The first one, interestingly, is Constable O'Brien, the first person who was killed during the uprising. Shamedly, the person next to him is the person who shot him. The two ladies down here, very interesting, both of whom were civilians, both of whom won the military medal for gallantry during the uprising. They were civilian ladies, they acted as nurses, they went out under heavy fire constantly to bring in British soldiers. And I believe that they are the only two civilians ever to have been awarded the military medal. And of course, as Quincy also mentioned, the IRA were not formed until 1917. So they have nothing to do with the Easter uprising. Talking about myths and claiming things, I mentioned Northumberland Road. There was 13 men in the houses around Northumberland Road, and I apologise for the smallness of pictures. You can quite clearly see the British troops marching down Northumberland Road from the docks in Dublin in formation, and those 13 men opened fire on them and accounted for approximately half of the British Army casualties that took place. And interestingly, the stamps that are bought out this Easter by the Irish government put 2 people on it, and they are either the Mallon or Malone brothers, I forget which, one of which was the leader in Cadbury Bridge. The other was his brother, who was shot 3 months later by the Germans in Flanders, in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. I think the statistics really speak for themselves. These people had no mandate, they had no popular support, they were just a bunch of blokes belonging to a secret society who wanted to force their views on the rest of Dublin. I'd like to think I've answered the question, who were the Republican forces? They were the IRB, they were Hibernian Rifles, they were the Irish Citizens' Army, they were the Irish Volunteers. Nothing like people these days claim them to be. Who were the British forces? The majority of them. As this excellent book will tell you, the majority of them were Irish. From the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, from the Leinster Regiment, Royal Irish Rifles. And it was only when we got reinforcements from service battalions from England that we were able to make a difference. Were they English soldiers? Was Trooper Patrick Lee an English soldier? Was Constable James O'Brien, Dublin Metropolitan Police? I think they were English soldiers. Were they brave, the rebels? Well, I put it to you, they were utterly self-appointed. In 1867 they declared an Irish Republic. It was just some blokes in a room in a pub declaring it. They had no support. They had no support from the people of Dublin. And they had no electoral mandate. They had no support from anybody. My last point is unequal treatment of leaders. Again, you hear the rhetoric of how terrible it was that the British shot 16 of their leaders. We also shot 306 of our gallant soldiers for cowardice and desertion. They were shot at dawn during the First World War. These days it would be called PTSD. In 1916 things were very different. Okay, yeah, we shot 16 of the leaders. Bearing in mind, all the Irish press was clamouring for it. The Irish press, in 1916, was telling the people, we need to shoot these leaders. We also shot 306 men at dawn for cowardice, desertion, because of their mental health problems. That's it. Thanks for your time.
Well, that was certainly powerful, and I'm sure, folks, you've never heard a presentation like that before, and presented the way it was. Totally enlightening, totally informative, and thank you very much for that. We're delighted to have you along this evening, and delighted to really interesting perspective you put on our event this evening. The night is moving on, but we do have one more presenter this evening, and that's Richard Edgar. He's an author, he's an historian, and he's well known to most of us tonight. So without further ado, it's all yours.
Tom Campbell, an officer in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, was in Dublin at the time of the uprising. And he was so disgusted by what happened. He was actually a nationalist. MP for East Tyrone, a Home Rule MP. But he said, these men will be remembered as heroes and martyrs. I will go down, if I do go down, as a bloody British officer. And just like Carla said, we don't know our own history. They know who these men are. And we have let the history of these other men be written out of our story. You could say maybe I'm a bit nosy, because when it comes to I look at history, and the history I'm interested in is the history of the people. More a social history and a history of what's going on in the area. 2 years ago, I was doing a talk in Portadown at the town hall, and a man, James Crockett, who lives on the Guildford Road in Portadown, came round to me afterwards, and I put this picture up here. This picture is Grange Gorman Military Cemetery in Dublin, and these are the graves of some of the boys who were killed during the Easter Uprising. And when I finished the talk, James came round and he says, Richard, thank you very much for talking about Dublin. And I was going, what's he on about? And he says, my uncle was killed in the Dublin Rising, and his name's on the Diamond War Memorial in London there. I was going, here's a man from Portadown, and he has a family member killed in the Dublin Rising. I was thinking, everyone thought all these men died in the Great War. He was serving the Enniskillen Fusiliers. Lieutenant James Love Crockett. He was serving with the Enniskillen Fusiliers in Dublin at the time. He was a strong unionist from a strong unionist family. He's the third name down there. That's where he signed the Ulster Covenant. At his funeral in 2nd Londonderry Presbyterian Church, the minister said, this man has died for his king and country every bit as much as any man who has died on the Western Front. And he's buried in Londonderry City Cemetery, this man. I'm going to talk to you about 6 people, and I tried to get people who had a link to the local areas to get you some kind of story along with it. And as Tony was just saying, the first man to die was a policeman, Constable O'Brien. The rebels walked up to O'Brien and he says, now come on boys, you're going to cause a bit of trouble here, let's be having you all the way home. And they turned round and murdered him in cold blood. This man here, County Inspector Alexander Gray, he was in charge of the police in the whole of Dublin County. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, so he's a good enough fella in my eyes. He was born in Athaloo in Athnacloy, and he was in Ashbourne Police Station, and around 200 rebels surrounded Ashbourne Police Station and ordered the police to surrender. The police would not come out. The policemen in the station fought them until they ran out of ammunition, and eventually all 8 policemen in the station were killed. This man from Athnacloy, before he went to Dublin to take over the police, he was the district inspector of the police here in Lurgan. He is well known all around Lurgan. Tony was just talking about the Sinn Féin Rebellion Handbook. A friend of mine gave me a copy of it last week. I was reading through it, and I found this boy, Sergeant Thomas Riley, Royal Irish Constabulary of Portadown, County Armagh, who even Sinn Féin themselves had to admit, for conspicuous gallantry in arresting and capturing a leading rebel whose capture during the early part of the rebellion was of the greatest importance. He had a man from Portadown. He was a career policeman. His father had been a policeman before him. He was in Galway. He wasn't actually in Dublin. And in true cowboy fashion, I suppose half these Lurgan people are going to say everyone from Portadown's a bit of a cowboy. But In true cowboy fashion, Patrick Fahey, the leader of the rebels in Galway, along with his local priest, were coming up the road carrying the weapons to get the rebellion going outside Dublin. And they were coming up, and Thomas Riley, seen them coming, pulled out his service revolver and says, "I'll give you 10 seconds to put those guns down and put your hands up." And the rebel leaders surrendered. Such heroes, one policeman, and they were coming up. That's how us Portadown men do it. But in 1919, the IRA kidnapped Riley and they brought him away. They said, "Oh, we didn't present him any threat, we only wanted to interrogate him." But the policemen in the end days weren't like me, they were big lumps of men. So when the IRA got him away, Riley spotted his chance. He got up with his fists and he beat the IRA man who was holding him so much that he got the gun off him. He shot the other 2 members of the gang and he made good his escape. Sinn Féin again had to put that in their book about the bravery of this Portadown policeman. After the rebellion, Riley went to Buckingham Palace to be presented with a King's Police Medal by the King for his bravery during the uprising. We're talking about the reserve battalions. We all know about the 16th Royal Irish Rifles based here at Brownlow House. But whenever the 16th Royal Irish Rifles left Lurgan in 1915, the 10th Reserve Battalion, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, took over. These are the Lurgan men from that battalion who were wounded during the rising. They were sent down, and they're all names you'll hear regular around Lurgan still. And there's some leading figures. Bernison here, Bernison was a well-known Dunavon footballer. Somerville was from one of 5 brothers, and we've had the politicalisation of the Irish language. Somerville's brother was a prolific poet, and he had poems printed right throughout the war in the Lurgan Mail. And he was an Orange man and a Unionist, and he also had poems printed in the Irish language. So don't believe all this nonsense they're putting out trying to block us out of the identity. No Unionist should be afraid to acknowledge the Irishness in our identity. It's the Republicans who will not identify the Britishness in their identity. This man here, Rifleman David Wilson, he was a married man with 3 children. He came from Hill Street in Lurgan. At the time, Wilson had been living in Scotland. You'll see if you go through the Lurgan War Memorial, a lot of boys were in the Highland Fusiliers. It's actually a Glasgow regiment. These boys all went to Glasgow seeking work. Wilson had come home, and just as Tony said, they were fighting this highly trained might of the British Army. Wilson had been in the army 7 days at the time he was killed. He was killed during the assault on the Jacobs factory in Dublin. He's buried in Dublin, this man. This man here, there's a man here in the middle. This is Frank Henry Browning. Frank Henry Browning, when August 1914, the war had just started, and you hear about all these PALS battalions in England. Well, Frank Henry Browning thought he was an Irish cricket international, and he was also an Irish rugby international. He was the president of the Irish Rugby Union, and he was also president of the Irish Cricket Union. Browning thought, here we are, all these fit boys and all these sporting organisations I'm in charge of, and he called on rugby players and cricket players from across Ireland to come forward, and he was going to form a PALS battalion of the Dublin Fusiliers, the 7th Dublin Fusiliers. This is D Company, with Frank standing at the front, pictured at Lansdowne Road in Dublin. We've all been watching the Six Nations recently. These men, within 6 months, over half of them were killed at Suvla Bay in Gallipoli during the landings. But Henry, he was too old to serve. He went into the training battalion with all the old codgers, the Dad's Army. You could near see him asking, can he be excused? This is Henry, and this is him as a young man being capped for Ireland when he was playing rugby. Well, Henry and all the other old men were out on the training battalion, out on the hills outside Dublin that day. And they were marching back into Beggar's Bush to where their camp was. They had guns but no ammunition. As they come up the Northumberland Road, rebels, under the control of Eamon de Valera, who claims to be a great Ireland rugby fan, shot and killed Frank Henry Brown, the head man of the Irish Rugby Union. As I said, de Valera, he went on to become Irish president. The other rebels actually called him the Mexican. He was born in New York with a Spanish father. You know, and he'd tell us we're not Irish. This man here come from County Louth, and he was serving in the Royal Irish Rifles. He joined the Royal Irish Rifles as a private. He'd headed off Samuel James Emerson. He'd been off to the war, he was wounded, was sent home for recuperation. He comes from Conlon in County Louth. During the rebellion, when he was recuperating, he was in Dublin. The rebellion started and the rebels tried to take a number of strategic buildings. A captain, a sergeant and 3 privates, one of them young Emerson, went to the Bank of Ireland and they occupied the Bank of Ireland. The rebels tried to bring Ireland's finances down by capturing the bank. The whole time of the rebellion, they couldn't get in. Emerson and the other boys fought them off. At the end of the rebellion, the manager of the Bank of Ireland in Dublin came round. He gave the officer £5, the sergeant £3, and each of the privates £2 each as a thank you for saving his bank. Samuel Emerson, when he recovered from his wounds, received a commission in the army, and he was sent then to serve in the Enniskillen Fusiliers, in the 9th Enniskillen Fusiliers at Tyrone Volunteers. Emerson was from a Unionist family. He was an Orangeman. His father was a member of the Unionist Party in County Louth. When he joined the Enniskillen Fusiliers, he headed off to the war. In 1917, he was awarded the Victoria Cross for leading an attack and then repelling the German attack all day. It was about 10 attacks that he held back, but he was actually killed during that fighting. This is his mother, Eileen, and his older brother, Alex, in 1919. In Drogheda Town Hall, despite the Union Jack being on the table, they were there to be presented with the Victoria Cross that was going to be given to her son. You can see that happening in Drogheda now. This is a man you've all seen behind me and all here. Lieutenant James Howard Calvert from the Avenue Road here in Lurgan. Just like Wilson, Calvert was killed during the assault on the biscuit factory in Dublin. He had been in the officer training corps at Queen's University. His brother had previously been in it. His brother was studying medicine at Queen's, so he followed his brother into the army. Again, Calvert wasn't long in the army. He was on his way down to Dublin to make his way across when the rebellion started. And sadly, Calvert was to be killed. If you go to Seago Cemetery in Portadown, on the side the school's on, if you go right up to the wall, if you walk up about 10-20 feet, that's where you'll find Calvert's grave. It was recorded at the time, it was the biggest funeral that they'd ever seen in Lurgan at the time. This military funeral, when they laid Calvert down through Lurgan from his home to bring him to Seago in Portadown where they'd bury him. I think you wouldn't be expecting to find someone from the Easter Uprising buried in Portadown, but he is, that's where he's buried, if any is go across. And I was told to keep this to 15 minutes, so I'm not going on, that's why I'm coming around quickly. So I'd like to, I'm not actually a member of Anchor Psalm Association, but I'm very pleased that they asked me along here tonight to speak to you all. And I hope you all found what I'm saying interesting and informative. And I want to leave you with the thought, when you're wearing your poppy with pride this November, I want you to remember, you're not just wearing it for people who fell and served on a foreign field. You're also wearing it in memory of those who fought and those who died and continue to die here on the home front. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our evening, and I'm sure that you will agree with me that the speakers tonight have been of an absolute excellent category, and we want to thank them, each and every one, for what they have brought to tonight's gathering and for the various presentations and the information that they have given us tonight. Certainly enlightening, and certainly we'll leave this place tonight, I hope, better educated than we arrived here tonight, knowing what we know now and what we have known in the past, and we are delighted that you were able to come and to hear all these presentations tonight. I love history, I like to study history, and I think that we all need to know our history. We need not only to learn our history, but we need to learn from history. And we need to learn that we make the same mistakes that were made before. And that's why it's important, and I know, and I commend the Anchor Psalm Association for taking on the task of trying to educate our folk and trying to keep in remembrance those that have fallen, those that have given their lives, those that have made the supreme sacrifice. And as an honorary member of the Anchor Psalm Association tonight, I would ask that everybody here would indeed give the committee and members of the association a round of applause for their work. And just one more time, folks, just to show your appreciation to all those who have been speaking tonight. Councillor Carla Lockhart, Quincy Dugan, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Maher, and Richard Edgar, and of course Rhonda for singing to us tonight. If you would indeed, just one more round of applause to show your appreciation. On behalf of the Anchor Psalm Association, we'd like to thank you personally for coming along this evening, for taking the time to join with us. We remind you tomorrow of the parade that will take place, and everybody is invited to come along and join with us as we take to the streets, and there will be a wreath laying ceremony at the War Memorial, and then on the Avenue Road Estate at the just opposite where Calvert lived, and a wreath will be laid there as well. And don't be put off by the weather. The men who give their lives weren't put off by the weather. And come and join and support the folk as they parade tomorrow. And despite what some of our enemies or protagonists would say, It's not coat trailing, but it's remembering. It's remembering. And lest we forget. So thank you to one and all. And we'll now, nothing else to add, Mark? Just nothing else to add. Thank you very, very much. We'll now stand for our national anthem.